Good morning, everyone. Hello. Yes, I believe we are. So I would like to welcome everybody to this Symposium of InterPARES Trust. We are delighted to be at Regis College in Denver, Colorado, and I would like to thank our hosts at Regis for giving us this space to hold this symposium. We are live streaming, and we'll be recording. The recording will be available later. So was there an introduction from Regis, or are we just launching in?
Well, I can say a few words. Should I use the mic?
Yes, please, because we've got you don't need to use the mic, but come and be in the camera.
And so I've been involved with Regis since 2012, I think, including a member of the board of the Anderson College of Business and Computing. And it's been a fertile ground for me because all the things we're dealing with are new to them. And so they've been very receptive. And this meeting has been in the works for about 3 years now, planning with the university staff and professor. And so welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here. I hope, and all you people online, that you will find this a very worthwhile day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So I would like to begin by introducing Dr. Luciana Durante. Dr. Durante is since 1987 a professor of archival theory, diplomatics, and digital records in the master's and doctoral archival programs of the School of Information of the University of British Columbia in Canada, and since 2011 an affiliate professor at the University of Washington in Seattle in the United States. Professor Durante is director of the UBC Center for the International Study of Contemporary Records and Archives, and since 1998, the principal investigator of the InterPARES research project. She has published extensively on archival and diplomatics theory and on the use of their concepts for understanding the products of new technologies. Since 2015, she's the chair of the Canadian Government Standards Board Committee for Electronic Records as Documentary Evidence. Luciana.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to talk to all of my colleagues here and the wonderful guest with whom I have been conversing about ancient languages. So I'm going to talk about generally about the project. I think that the entire project is based on a premise that records and archives are the critical infrastructure that support our values and our beliefs and principles. And this is why we need to maintain and verify their trustworthiness. And within the concept of trustworthiness, their reliability, accuracy, and specifically their authenticity. So when we were in the paper environment, we were able to protect the authenticity of the record after having assessed it based on the form of the record, on the provenance of the record, and on the documentary context. However, this was possible because records were inextricably and permanently linked to the medium on which they were written. So this idea was linked to the integrity of the record through time. The problem is that digital records cannot be kept, maintained, or preserved as they were created. It is only possible to maintain our ability to reproduce them and to recreate them. So when we talk about reproduce, that means when we close a digital record, we basically take it apart in all its digital components. When we recall it, we generate a copy. When we talk about recreate a record, we think in terms of we have a database. If we ask the same query over and over again, we should get the same answer every time. But in that case, we are generating a new record in that case. So This means that digital records are always green, are always new. So how do we prove the authenticity of digital records? Well, the assessment of the authenticity in the digital environment is always an inference that is based on elements that are external to the record. There may be significant properties as shown in the metadata, the identity metadata and integrity metadata, and it relies on circumstantial evidence. For example, in Canada, if we believe that the system in which the record has been stored through time has integrity, then we infer that the record has integrity. Or may depend on the policies and procedures that control the life of the record, or on the technology that encrypts or secures the access to the record. So can artificial intelligence help us with this issue? We know that artificial intelligence systems provide evidence that is inconclusive because it is based on probabilities, that is unscrutable because it's not transparent, that may be misguided because it is only as good as the data that are provided to the model. May be unfair, may have unfair outcomes with disproportionate consequences for different groups of people. May have transformative effects which challenge the autonomy and privacy of people. And it is very hard to assign responsibility for whatever it does for its products. And of course, decisions made by AI systems are based on past decisions. And when it comes to human affairs, tomorrow rarely resembles today. And data can't say what has a moral value or what is socially desirable. Now, in 2018, there was a declaration in Montreal which listed the requirements for the trustworthiness of the products of AI systems. And they were respect for well-being principle, for the autonomy of people, for privacy, solidarity, democratic participation, equity, diversity and inclusion, caution, responsibility, and sustainable development. Now, artificial intelligence has been used in the past in several projects for controlling and accessing records in archives or in a records management situation. But typically, all these experiments have looked at specific tools in a single set of records. And they were things like recurrent neural networks for classification of the content of large aggregations of records, recommendation systems that connect relevant images to digitized letters, chatbots that emulate human conversation through voice commands or text chats, a combination of named entity recognition, entity relation tools, and topic modeling to create visualization tools, etc. Now, what is the problem with all of this? Why we're doing this research? Well, because all the studies on AI for records have relied on existing off-the-shelf tools. And this reliance on off-the-shelf tools limits what challenges can be met, and it makes the needs of record governance subservient to the field of machine learning. So it is practical, yes, it is always easier to go to a store and buy something than have to develop it yourself. But there are many tangible instances of biases that have been found in modern machine learning models. And these have been driven mostly by the data collection practices. So this raises the question of whether off-the-shelf tools are the best solutions for records, and what artificial intelligence would look like if this power relationship between AI and archives were reversed, with archival theory informing the creation of AI tools. So our answer has been to begin the fifth phase of InterPARES. So the InterPARES research project was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada initially in 1998. Since then, it has addressed digital records issues, focusing on current and emerging technologies as they evolve over time, and developing theory, methods, and frameworks that allow for the ongoing trusted preservation of the records that result from the use of such technologies. The fifth and latest iteration of InterPARES, I Trust AI, differs from the previous one in a fundamental way because it is not concerned with the records produced by a specific technology, but has the purpose of using AI to carry out archival functions for the control in the long term of all records on any medium, also the paper ones, from any age, also the parchment ones, and to do so in such a way that the trustworthiness of the records remains protected and verifiable, and that the tools and the processes are transparent, unbiased, equitable, inclusive, responsible, and sustainable. So the goal of I Trust AI is to design, develop, and leverage artificial intelligence to support the ongoing availability and accessibility of trustworthy public records. And it does so by forming an ongoing partnership that produces original research, that trains students and other personnel, and links academia, archival institutions, government records professionals, the industry in a feedback loop that reinforce the knowledge and the capabilities of each party. The objectives are to identify specific AI technologies that can address critical record challenges, to determine the benefits and risks of using those technologies on records, to ensure the records concepts and principles inform the development of responsible AI, and to validate the outcomes of this process through case studies and demonstrations. We, in fact, have more than 40 case studies and journal studies that relate to several aspects of records creation, retention, disposition, preservation, and access. They're carried out by about 200 researchers. The countries actually are 36 to date. They're no longer 28. So I should correct that one. And organizations have reached the 100 number in the past 6 months. So we are organizing international and multidisciplinary teams that include experts from AI, records and archives management, forensics, the law, data science, engineering, etc. Methods. Our approach is two-pronged because it comprises the practical need to address the problems that are already there, and also the longer-term need to develop AI tools that are applicable to future problems. And so the short-term approach focuses on identifying high-impact problems and limitations in records and archives functions and applying AI to improve the situation. The long-term approach focuses on identifying the tools that records and archives specialists will need in the future to flexibly address their ever-changing needs. Now, the fact that I Trust AI is a multinational, interdisciplinary endeavor means that our first effort, which has actually lasted a couple of years, had to be to understand each other, starting with the language that we use. For example, archival professionals talk about records, computer scientists, AI professionals talk about data. To archivists, data are the smallest meaningful unit of information in a record. to an AI specialist, data are organized information, possibly in a database, be it facts or not, regardless of size, nature, and form. And lately, I hear no longer the word data from them, I hear content. Give me content to work on this specific AI tool. So key to our work have been AI tutorials and workshops for non-AI researchers and archival and diplomatic theory tutorials for non-archival researchers. And this endeavor have been supported by a terminology database, which is developed in collaboration with a multidisciplinary team. So clearly, InterPARES researchers know that the dominant perspective is the archival perspective. We are here to solve archival issues. Archival terminology is to be used in the project outputs. We use deep learning, and I will let Mohamed explain what that is and not go into it. But it is important that in order to use deep learning methodology, we need a large amount of labeled data. And we aim in our case studies to label data according to diplomatic methodology, because that's what diplomatics does, takes a document apart and names each part of it. And so this type of learning, of course, is supervised learning, cannot be otherwise. And we are trying to apply it to a number of cases. The expected outcome, well, the project will improve upon existing tools and create new machine learning tools that will address the archival needs, like machine translation, image recognition and description. So we will use optical character recognition, etc. And Mohamed will talk about the textile transfer for language civilization, I'm sure, at one point, removal of bias, hate, and sexism. So the studies are all international and interdisciplinary. So within each team, for each study, we try to get people from various countries and various disciplines so that all the points of view are respected. They focus on all aspects of archival functions. They usually organize by function, so creation, appraisal, arrangement and description, retention and preservation, management and administration, reference and access. However, there are some studies that are general, that is, that relate to all the functions. One is obviously the development of the terminology, but think of all the educational studies. There are at least 2 studies that are about education for professionals about the use of AI. And then, for example, the Paradata study that is about how the archival profession has to document its own use of AI tools. Indirect outcomes are the creation of new professionals. There will be well over 100 professionals who will have worked as student research assistants on case studies with testbed organizations and who will spread the acquired knowledge. It is a recurrent event in the life of the InterPARES projects that the people who had been research assistant in a project eventually get a job in an archives or in a records management situation, and then they bring that organization or that institution in the following project. So they move from being student research assistant to being researchers themselves. And that is one of the achievements. Another achievement that we aim for is to bring students from our disciplines like computer scientists, lawyers, etc., archaeologists, to understand and value the archival perspective on their work and the impact on society. There is also knowledge co-creation because the project will enrich archival science, records management, AI, cybersecurity, information science, law, ethics, etc. And also, we aim to sensitize AI developers, AI scholars, and other members of the community to the role of AI in record keeping and archival preservation, and to the role of archival concepts and principles in AI design and development. You see the country 36. I updated it there, but not on the other one. In 36 country, 100 partner organization, and these are the numbers. And thank you very much. And now you will hear what are the specific studies.
Thank you, Luciana. Okay, I'm going to now introduce Richard Arias Hernandez, and oops.
We're going to have.
I'm going to at the end. Yeah.
At the end of the
Okay, Dr. Richard Arias Hernandez is an associate professor at UBC, focusing on digital libraries, digital collections, information systems, information visualization, data management, analytics, and visualization at the iSchool graduate programs and in the Bachelor of Media Studies. His current research focuses on curriculum design for archival studies programs to leverage and incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning into archival and records management practices. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Corinne. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here joining you guys today. I'm going to be speaking during the next 20 minutes or so about one of the studies mentioned by Dr. Durante in her introduction. And it's a study that focuses on education. And the broader title of the project is called Teachable AI for Archival Professions. But today I'm going to be focusing on a recent development in the project, which is the development of competences for archival professionals regarding AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning. First of all, an acknowledgement. This is the result of a team project. It's teamwork. Several people have been involved, either as GRAs. Currently, Kyla Fuster. She's also my co-author in the papers that we're writing. And our former student, Sophie Pennyman, who was in charge of the interviews for this project, and also in the beginning of the analysis. But also some research collaborators who are going to be very actively testing the educational modules that we're developing, so that we can have also feedbacks of how these educational modules actually work in training grounds. We had participants providing their insights for the development of these competencies. Those names are right there. And also professionals who have been involved in the validation in workshops that we conducted this summer at ACA and Expo Tecnología 2024 in Medellin, Colombia. The inspiration for focusing on education regarding AI and ML, obviously, we need to get started asking, do we need more training? Do we need more education? There's a lot of stuff that is already being included in our CAPA programs today. Do we need to include more, right? Do we need to update our training and competences as educators? Do we need to include more in our curricula? Do we need to provide workshops for professional development? There's a lot of training available on AI and machine learning. You just Google, you're going to find resources on Coursera, Khan Academy, modules that are available from MIT, different options. However, what is common to those is that they are either oriented towards a computer science audience or a general audience. So either they tend to be generic in terms of providing AI literacy. For example, in the European Union, there's an initiative that has been developing this kind of learning modules, but it's for the general audience. While if you go to the more specialized modules at MIT or Google, they tend to be more technical oriented. But there are no developments that target archival professionals as an audience, or the needs of archival professionals as learners. So there was clearly a gap that we found there that motivated this kind of project. The other aspect that we found lacking when we started a couple of years ago, it was that there was nothing in terms of creating this kind of learning modules based on empirical evidence, talking to an archivist, talking to the records managers, talking to the professionals who are actually testing these tools or interested in testing these tools. But it was basically, coming from academics or industry. So we want to hear from the professionals and bring up their voices into the development of competencies and learning modules. So that was the motivation. We came out with this research question. What are learning outcomes, curriculum structure, activities, and assessment that can be designed for archival students and professionals to be able to leverage, make use of, and possibly design, at least in being involved into design teams in an informed way of artificial intelligence and machine learning to support ongoing processing, availability, and accessibility of trustworthy public records. Our methodology is detailed in a paper that we're going to be presented at ACES this weekend, actually on Sunday. So I'm not going to be talking a lot about the methodology, but a few aspects of that I'm highlighting is that we wanted to first identify who these professionals were, archivists and records managers, who were testing the waters, who were already engaging with artificial intelligence and machine learning, because is a good experimental ground to know what competencies they needed to develop in order to make these technologies work for archival work, for the processing of records, and invite them as participants for our study. So we conducted a lead review that focused on identifying those case studies. In 2022, the scope was 2012 to 2022, which is mentioned also as a limitation in the paper because they have been more developments during the recent years, but we're counting on that. And our focus was to identify use cases. What is it that people on the ground are doing, archival professionals with AI and ML? Obviously, it was in experimental levels, right? From that, we want to identify who these people were, archival or records management practitioners involved in these cases, to inviting for semi-structured interviews. And then identify potential material that they were making available, openly available, to be used as didactic material for educational modules and to bring it into the classroom. So that was another possibility that came during the lead review. As a result of that, we identify, 6 case studies developed between 2017 and 2021. You see several of those here. And as you can see, these are case studies who were deployed in actual archives or record management offices. And they use machine learning techniques. You see there natural language processing, entity recognition, topic modeling. Some of them were using applications that have been around for a while. For example, Stanford's EPA that is used for the processing of email records, and that is also using machine learning, while some other of these applications require archival professionals to actually engage with code. So we thought that was kind of an interesting spectrum in which professionals were engaging with these technologies at a very basic level and a more kind of applied level of technologies that are available off the shelf. These are the 2 cases that we identify. I'm going to talk about, for example, case number 5. This one came from a records management office and a state archives in New Zealand. Australia. This is New South Wales. The New South Wales State Archives in Australia. Interesting case in which the archivist was asked by the manager to actually experiment with machine learning. And the archivist had a little bit of background in statistics and started learning about how to use Python libraries to experiment with automated classification. So basically starting with retention and disposition schedule that had clear categories, and starting labeling records using those categories and testing whether the machine was actually helping classify these retention and disposition schedules correctly. So it was a very interesting experiment. The archivist actually made the data available, publicly available, wrote a couple of blogs detailing the process, which is also very helpful in terms of transmitting that knowledge to others. So it's something that, for example, we're including in our learning modules. And this is also something that I have included in some of my classes, since the data is available and the process is available and the code is available. So these were very interesting cases that were identified. Now, these cases, we documented those as case studies that can be brought also into the classroom. So we documented the 6 original case studies, and we have been growing those case studies with case study that we have been developing here at InterPARES, right? That, as Luciana mentioned, we work in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams that involve academics, but also professionals and archives. So we have been conducting some of those case studies right here within InterPARES. And so we're starting to document those to and turn it into educational modules. So that is available from the InterPARES website. I invite you guys to check them out. You go to dissemination, there are curriculum materials, and in the future, they're gonna be educational modules being published there as well. All of those openly available. Now, we identified about 25 professionals from these case studies. We invite them to participate in interviews in 2023 between January and June. 10 of those invited archival professionals responded and became actually participants in semi-structured interviews. We focus on conversations that try to track their competencies. What is it that they needed to learn in terms of knowledge? What is it that they needed to learn in terms of developing skills? And what kind of attitudes they displayed, right, in order to make artificial intelligence and machine learning work for them, for the processing of records. So that was our focus. We analyzed these interviews using thematic coding, actual coding, and we came out with these codes and categories that we structure in 3 sets that relate to competencies of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. This is again documented in the paper, but you can see that, for example, in terms of knowledge, these were key competencies that relate to archival principles and practices, and especially those that are being developed within the realm of, for example, research projects such as InterPARES, right? There are competencies that are currently being advanced and informed by the work that we're doing right here in InterPARES. The concept of paradata, for example, is contribution to archival theory that is coming from this engagement with AI and ML, but also traditional considerations of privacy, how do they manage those in the world of AI and ML, enrichment and description, the traditional principles and concepts of archival theory in engagement with AI and ML. There's the competencies related to algorithmic thinking, data analysis, understanding artificial intelligence and machine learning, the pipeline, how is it that people engage with a process to work with these tools, And competencies are related to critical thinking, critical data, critical artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Now, what you see there is not an exhaustive list of the topics. We actually develop a body of knowledge that is very extensive. This is just an example of some of the topics within each competency, but is way broader than this. It just doesn't fit in the slide. So we just chose a few. In terms of skills, is about the type of things that people need to do, not only to know, to make artificial intelligence and machine learning work for the processing of records. So a little bit about basic programming skills, especially if they are going to try to develop these tools from scratch and engage with coding and libraries, machine learning libraries, for example. Data-related skills, and this is very in line with what David Mordell calls datafication, basically the process of turning records into data that is going to be fed to artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms, and also the critical problems that come with it. It's not only about the technical skills, but in terms of knowledge, understanding the implications of turning archives into data. You guys are familiar with David Mordell's work, you know the issues about this. There's the specific skills that are related to artificial intelligence, such as labeling data, training and refining modules, learning about the metrics for evaluation, and coming up with those metrics. That's something that needs to be done to determine whether these models are efficient or not, and comparable to the work that humans do, that archival professionals do, and to determine exactly what the place of these tools in the workflow is. Tool testing adaptation to workflow skills, it was a critical one. That's the whole point, is just to make it work for the processing of records. And the last one I thought it was interesting is it also shows that archivists, the archivists and records managers that we interview, and we heard that also in the validation, they don't want to become coders. They're not interested in becoming coders. They're not interested in becoming software engineers. They're not interested in competing with them. They're interested in learning enough to do some things on their own, and also to collaborate with technologies to develop these solutions. There's also a little bit about attitude. So we had the knowledge, the skills, but this is more about the being, right? What kind of attitudes can be helpful in getting archivists to this place? Intellectual curiosity about how we can incorporate these technologies into archival institutions is one. Self-regulated learning is another one. Critical thinking and being a team player. So that comes along with everything that I mentioned before. Now, during this summer, we took the result of this research and we presented it to the professionals. So we went to ACA in Canada and also to Expo Tecnología in Latin America. So these are archival professional conferences attended by professionals, but also attended by students. And we conducted workshops in which we presented these competencies and conducted some activities. The people had a chance to rank the competencies, talked about what it was missing, talked about their own experiences. And you can see here, this is the result of the ranking of the two workshops. The first column shows the results of the ranking from most important to least important to the audience at ACA, and the second column, the results in Latin America. And as you can see, there are some matches and some similarities, but also plenty of differences between these audiences that took us to develop a second paper trying to explain these differences. Very interesting. There are some hypotheses, and a more empirical work needs to be done about that. But something that we found is that education and training in Canada happens at the master level, when in Latin America, most of it, the training for archivists and records managers happens at the undergrad level. Obviously, what we emphasize at the master level tends to be more critical, tends to be rely on work experiences of people over the years. We target the education so that people can also lead in their institutions and become managers, which is different than is done at the undergrad level, which in which education tends to be more generic and toward more practical aspects of the work. So that makes a difference. For example, that could explain a discrepancy such as the fact that critical thinking, critical data, critical ML, and ethics for archives ranks really high for Canadian, but extremely low in Latin America. There are also some possible explanations, or hypotheses that we propose in the paper, such as the exposure to specific tools, right? When you have access to off-the-shelf tools, then you don't need to know much about programming or scripting, right? When you don't have access to those, then you probably need to develop those competencies. It's kind of an spectrum of situation that is very contextual. An example that I presented in Australia, the archivists needed to develop competencies related to basic programming, right? Because of restrictions of using cloud services, of uploading records into a system that was going to exist outside of the jurisdiction. So those are contextual situations that demand specific competencies when products are not available. But if the product is available and the legislation allows for specific uses, maybe they don't need to know much about programming or coding or scripting. So those kind of contextual differences shape the needs for education and training. This one was very interesting. There was a perfect match in terms of ranking the skills between the Canadians and the Latin Americans. As you can see, they value, and again, highlights that aspect that people value more the collaboration. There are collaboration between archival professionals and technologists rather than just taking on the whole thing. And yeah, you can see that the AI ML skills and basic programming ranks really low here as well. Anyways, I'm just gonna skip because I'm already at 20 minutes. Another outcome of the project so far is that we took this feedback from the archivists and records managers on these validation workshops, and we identified that they want to know more about use cases. Yeah, in terms of education modules, they want to know is like, okay, what is it that people are doing with this processing of records, or how can I do it? Explain that to me from step one to the last step, one by one. So we developed a body of knowledge for these competencies, and then we took this feedback and plan a series of education modules that, as you can see, they map to the competencies. The first one is, the importance of archival principles and how AI and ML plays a factor or could play a factor for the processing of records based on what people are doing. So we took all of these use cases, turned it into educational modules, and put it into that module as a motivation for people to know exactly what is the place of AI and ML in the archival work. The critical aspects, and as you can see, I am biased towards the Canadians, so I think this is key and needs to be taught. So is a module in itself, and the first one, the introduction to AI, is already completed. We're in developing, and it's going to be ready by the end of November, the critical AI ML module. And as you can see, there's indigenous AI ML, which is important in Canada, maybe not as relevant in other countries, but for us, it ranks really up high. So we're dedicating a good piece of content for that. And the other ones that you can see, very oriented to use cases: AI to enhance access to text and image records, AI to enhance access to audio and video records, AI to support sensitivity analysis of digital records, AI for appraisal, retention, disposition, and large language models supporting description and referencing detailed archives. So very oriented towards use cases. We try to make it as practical as possible. These modules, the first one is already published, same place, InterPARES website, the introductory one. And as soon as we're developing the module, we're going to be publishing those there. What is next to the project is that collaborators in the team are going to be taking these modules into the classroom and into workshops, at professional conferences, and we need to test them. We need to see how people react to this. We need to evaluate them. And just continue improving this. So that's it. So the dissemination going on, but that, in a nutshell, that's what it is. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. We've got time for one question.
How to make the question short. I was very fortunate when I was at the NIH and got into management. Initially,
Richard,
I felt that
stand in front of the camera. You're the
I
only
felt
thing showing.
very bad because the pressures of being a manager, I didn't have time to do things professionally. Fortunately, NIH put me into a very long management training program when I realized that management is a separate profession. And one of the things that I took out of that as an archivist was that I don't really need to know how to write programs like I had been doing. I need to know how to evaluate technology for the purposes for which I'm going to use them, which could be appraisal or could be preservation, which gets very technical. In your work on educating archivists in the era of AI, does those kind of issues come up?
Yeah, 100%. Evaluation is one of the key competencies, first of all. Another one that is related to that is that business cases, right? You need to bring that to a business case. If you want to get support from management to continue implementing AI and machine learning for the archives. We heard that from several of the people we interviewed, but also from the people attending the workshops. Yeah, agreed, 100%.
Thanks very much. Okay, next I'm delighted to introduce Yuri Kuro. Yuri is pursuing a dual Master of Archival Studies and Library and Information Studies at the University of British Columbia. She has been a graduate research assistant for InterPARES Trust AI since January 2024, focusing on the relationships between AI, privacy, and archives. Yuri is currently the Secretary of ACA at UBC, which is the student chapter of the Association of Canadian Archivists, and has developed an academic interest in EDI, critical and trauma-informed pedagogy within the archival profession and practices. Welcome, Yuri.
Hi, well, thank you for that very kind introduction. It is a privilege and an honor to be here with everyone at the symposium today. Just FYI, if it looks like I'm crying, I'm not. One of my eyes is really, really watery and it keeps dropping tears, but I'm not crying about this, I promise. It looks like I am, so I'm just like forewarning. Okay, so this presentation, Where's the Balance? AI, Archives, and Privacy, was co-authored by myself, Iori, with Jim Suderman, Dr. Dara Hoffman, and Aaron Gilmore, who are from San Jose State University. And before I introduce our study, I just want to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. So Regis University recognizes that Indigenous peoples are the original stewards of the land we stand on today. I would like us all to respectfully acknowledge that this land is the traditional homeland and buffalo hunting grounds of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. Please also take time to recognize the 48 tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. I am an uninvited guest, both here and on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, also known as Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, from where I have traveled to be here today. But as my supervisor, Dr. Hoffman says, land acknowledged is not land given back. I don't have enough time on the stage to be as reflexive with my positionality as I would like to be, but as an archivist, I am cognizant of the fact that archives and archival practices have often been used to uphold a status quo that is underrepresented or harmed marginalized, especially Indigenous communities. It is with this understanding that I endeavor to not duplicate that harm within my research and future work. And I so urge you all to reflect on the lands on which you live and how your work impacts those people and their land. So, how are archival institutions protecting privacy in digital records containing PII when providing access to them? Well, generally speaking, they aren't. Providing access, that is. Archivists have historically taken on the role of a steward, sometimes trusted, sometimes not. In the early days, they were tasked with preserving the patriotic history of their nations, but quickly found themselves balancing the idealized nation against critical social memory. Archives have evolved to make space for both the old and the contemporary, for both the outdated and the new. A good archive is always in dialogue with itself. The archivist should constantly adapt based on those discussions. It is an archivist's responsibility to maintain an equilibrium between the records and the people in hopes of providing a public good. So, isn't access a public good? Why aren't archives providing access to the digital records then? It's not for a lack of trying. The unfortunate reality is, and for the risk of sounding like a broken record, that the digital backlog is so immense that archives physically cannot get around to manually protecting entire collections filled to the brim with personal identifiable information just to make them accessible to some people. As a point of reference, the US National Archives is preserving almost 300 terabytes of White House emails, but quote, none have been systematically opened by archivists for public access, nor is there any strategic plan for doing so in the immediate future, end quote. The increasingly complex and contentious nature of privacy may have swung the pendulum from access more so to privacy, especially from the standpoint of archivists, having many tools and much experience in providing access to records, but with much fewer tools and experience when it comes to protecting privacy. However, in not providing access to those records to protect privacy, archivists are staying faithful to their work. Archivists, at their core, are stewards. Just as they balance history and the modern day, they must find a way to create an equilibrium between privacy and access. Balance in this context does not mean a one-to-one ratio, but rather an assessment of what action results in the least amount of harm. The PI Literature Review, hoping for a solution that would assist archivists in mitigating their hindered access dilemma, put together an annotated bibliography that aggregated and recontextualized articles from the domains of archival studies, computer science studies, and legal studies, exploring the extent to which and how artificial intelligence tools and techniques could address or resolve privacy challenges faced by archival institutions. The literature we analyzed primarily answered our first 4 research questions. 1, how are archival institutions dealing with protecting privacy in digital records containing PII when providing access to them? 2, how could AI tools and techniques contribute to the challenges faced by archival institutions in providing access to those records? 3, what are the implications of using AI tools and techniques to deal with privacy issues in those records? And 4, how effectively can machine learning, natural language processing, and named entity recognition enable the identification and location of personal information in large digital textual collections? Based on our research questions, we began an iterative review of the literature. In screening for inclusion, we included date, peer review, type of publication, research setting, and research design. We started with searching for literature from 2017 and the subsequent years because we recognized the breakthroughs happening with AI in 2016. However, critical earlier publications, specifically concerning privacy, also found their place in our review because the privacy issues from before have not yet been resolved. Understanding that not all privacy, archival, or computer science work happens in peer-reviewed journal articles, we also expanded types of publication to include gray literature and white papers and reports. Both research setting and research design were inclusive. Throughout the course of our study, multiple graduate research assistants have graciously contributed to the annotated bibliography. They plotted out the objectives, research questions, core concepts, research setting, research design, key findings, and implications for each article. But not displayed in our annotated bibliography is how we also charted types of study, so whether it was archival, legal, or computer science, jurisdiction, so North American versus European privacy laws, privacy scopes, from very broad, such as private user data, to very specific types of personal data, like email addresses, messages, and headers, how the study dealt with privacy, what success measures they considered, whether human intervention was needed with regard to the AI model, and what novel model ideas we could use for future interrogation. We originally organized the articles under the 3 domains of concern: archival studies, computer science studies, and legal studies. The assumption at the time was that the division would facilitate identifying patterns within each field. However, we removed the categories because it became evident that the domains were not mutually exclusive and that there was a more overarching issue at hand. Primarily, how do professionals define and apply privacy? The findings and discussions and conclusions found within the articles of this annotated bibliography were vast and diverse. They provided insights into privacy and AI conversations from around the world. We couldn't find anything else that did it the same way we did. The articles that have been aggregated and codified shatter the notion that each discipline is its own island. The archivists grapple with computer scientists, who grapple with the legal professionals, who grapple with the archivists. Despite the little attention they pay to one another, the findings of one discipline should have a great deal of impact on the other. Barron and Payne, Goldman and Payette, Yako, and Murphy and others lamented how access was being hindered because archival institutions had no other means of dealing with PII aside from manual redaction, which consumes more resources than archivists have available to them, namely time and labor. However, the plight of archivists is not unique to them. Barron, born in Barron, Diaz, McDonald's and others, Glacier and others, Ogeson and others, Temper and others, all write about the same limitation of having to protect PII through manual means, but from a legal context. However, it is primarily those in the legal studies who have investigated AI and machine learning as a means of overcoming those access issues. This demonstrated to us that archival studies remained introspective and considered the nature of sensitivity, context, and privacy within their collections. But the legal and computer science domains are already investigating and providing potential solutions to dealing with PII in more automated fashions. It is worth noting that while computer science studies are experimenting with machine learning, natural language processing, and named entity recognition to test the efficacy of these techniques when it comes to identifying, redacting, and anonymizing PII in their records, the computer scientists are primarily concerned with the unavailability of training data sets and their success measures for the field, including precision, recall, accuracy, and/or F1 scores, which may serve as adequate measures for determining how well an algorithm identifies true and false positives and negatives, but determining whether or not data is private and to whom access to data can be given continues to remain a weighted question on the archivist's shoulders. Lemieux and Warner explain, in their scoping review of privacy-enhancing techniques for archives, that despite experimentation with AI-enabled, primarily natural language processing-based approaches, effective ways to responsibly balance provision of access with protection of privacy remains elusive for archivists. This is largely due to the complexities of applying existing privacy approaches to large and often poorly described archival collections. The results of such approaches are insufficiently accurate, and even if accurate models are developed, current privacy solutions fall short of the scale needed for archival privacy management. Less human-dependent approaches, like neural networks, likewise lack the accuracy needed at this point in time. So, deploying privacy tools that are insufficiently accurate could erode trust in both the tools and the archival institutions that might use them. Despite the kinks in the technology, Barron and Payne contend that, quote, archivists can no longer rely on manual methods, end quote, because AI can filter sensitive data, allowing for quicker access to records online. Therefore, the relationship between privacy, archives, and AI is multidirectional. Simply relying on AI solutions to solve the problem of balancing privacy and access risk further entrenching known issues in both AI and archives. However, having perfected the balancing act of a steward, archivists must consider how applying archival knowledge and practices, such as rich description of provenance, can mitigate problems within AI. Because as Hentonen explains in Privacy as an Archival Problem and a Solution, the application of archival practices is critical for the protection of personal privacy now and in the future. Another potential approach to interpreting privacy relies on the theory of contextual integrity, which Nassenbaum uses to define privacy as a relative rather than a static concept. One's privacy is not always violated when a certain piece of information is shared, but rather when it is shared in an unexpected context or way. Hentonen suggests that since archival work is a secondary use of records, archives are inherently violating the privacy of those within the records, in which case strategies must be devised by archivists to address the ethical dilemma beyond burying the records. Moss and Gollins urge archivists to shift their focus from technical challenges of digital preservation, and instead they need to work on appraisal, sensitivity review, and access assisted or facilitated through AI and machine learning. The authors believe, quote, the archive has to take what it is given from the context in which the users have chosen to use it, end quote. It takes little thought to be critical of archivists. No one is more attuned to the fact that they need to be better at providing access to digital records than archives are themselves. Instead, we must understand that they have been stewards for centuries. Every decision is a compromise. Privacy and access are semantically at odds with each other, and archivists are constantly making judgments about what action results in the least amount of harm and the most public good. At the same time, the lack of action taken towards protecting PII in records is not solely an issue of insufficient resources, though the amount of manual labor and expertise that goes into redacting PII is profound, but rather a lack of strategic planning within archives to slow the steady growth of PII backlog in their collections. There needs to be a shift away from a purely compliance-based approach to a risk-based strategy that is cognizant of the fact that just because digital records with PII are inaccessible to the public does not mean that the personal information is still protected in that digital environment. Part of an archive strategy could involve a risk-based appraisal process, which leans on provenance as a means of determining sensitivity and privacy concerns within a collection. We look forward to learning more from recent and future interviews conducted with archivists, such as White and Walsh's recent work that provide an insight into the daily practices surrounding privacy protection, which have not yet been documented in the literature. The question upon synthesizing all of our literature is no longer whether AI can identify and then redact, anonymize, or pseudonymize PII, as it has already been proven to do so for recognizable named entities, but rather, can archivists, legal professionals, and computer scientists look beyond the existing attempts to define privacy and begin to develop sufficiently rich, applied understandings of privacy to support the development of robust privacy AI solutions that enable archivists to carry the ethical burden of having to judge when access takes precedence over privacy and when privacy takes precedence over access, responsibly and effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Yori. We do have time for questions for Yori, if anyone has any questions. No questions, I guess. Thank you so much,
Thank
Yori.
you.
Okay. I would now like to introduce Hugo Lambergier. Dr. Hugo Lambergier is an associate professor in computer science here at Regis University. Prior to joining Regis, he was an assistant professor with the Catholic University of the West in France and worked as a developer and research scientist for Phase Change Software, a company which specializes in artificial intelligence for program analysis. His research and interests revolve around logic, mathematics, and theoretical computer science, with focuses on lambda calculus, combinatory logic, intentionality, and computation theory. Welcome, Hugo. You'll get your slides going here.
Oh, yeah, I replaced it with a new version.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right. No, that's all right.
It's right here,
Is it,
the 4. Yeah, this one. There you go.
no, share it with the same people. Yes. Sure.
Yeah, you can go back to this one.
It won't get rid of this thing. So let's do this. Hopefully that is the correct.
Yeah. I'm just gonna quickly. Why it doesn't? Okay. Okay. And how do we slideshow? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'd like to talk about the logic side of the ontology called record and context. So we talked a lot about that already, and I will try to take a specific different angle to the same problem I talked about during the workshop. First, I would like to talk about the ambition of record in context, because I think it's important to point out what they're trying to do here. So we talk about the International Council on Archives that is developing this ontology called Records in Context. We are now at the version 1.0.2, and here are some excerpts from their presentation page. RICO, I'm going to talk about record in context ontology as RICO, like we often do, provides a generic vocabulary and formal rules for creating data sets that describe in a consistent way any kind of archival record resource. It supports publishing RDF data sets as linked data and making inferences using the logic of the ontology. It also says RICO is a technical implementation of record in context conceptual model that includes formal logic. It is a generic domain ontology, a high-level framework. So it's important to understand how ambitious the project is, right? Because the idea is to completely and formally define, like we do in mathematics, the domain of archival description. And it's a very large domain. We'll talk about that. Maybe uniquely large, if you think about it. So it's much more, and I really want to emphasize that, it's much more than a useful tool for archival description or search or reasoning, right? It is a formal and normative description of what archives and records are, what they are, right? It's supposed to be a definition. So if you cannot recognize in it what they are, then there is a problem. Important question is, what is the truth criteria behind an ontology? How can you actually judge if it's correct or not? And here, I think mathematics can help us. So I'm going to be inspired here from Haskell Curry in 1951, who developed, he wrote an outline of a formalist philosophy of mathematics. And I think that can help us put some concrete definition on all of that. Imagine you have a whole world of statements, possible statements. A theory is going to be a class of true statements that we're going to call theorems. So statements are, I don't know why my, okay, there it is. So a theory is going to be a subclass of statements that are true. So that means the statements in our world of statements are going to be either true or false with respect to a theory. So you're going to have to bring a theory to be able to say if a statement is true or false. And that actually really nicely fits the idea of context in recording context. A theory really provides a context to determine the truth of a statement. A theory is deductive if it is an inductive class. That means if you can actually get to some theorems from more basic theorems that we call axioms. It's decidable if it's definite class. It means you can actually find a way to get all the theorems in the theory. And it is consistent if it doesn't exhaust all the statements. That's kind of a strange idea, but when you think about it, if the theory really encompasses all the statements, then there is no more theory. It's inconsistent. So whenever you have an inconsistent theory, you can really prove anything. And it's complete if it is incapable of a consistent axiomatic extension. I'm not going to talk much about that. It's actually a very strong requirement. Some of you probably have heard of the theorem of incompleteness of arithmetics by Kurt Gödel. It's actually related to, it's actually what it is. Having a complete system is not always the case. It really means that anything that is true for that system will be provable. An interpretation of the theory, and this is the important part for us, is going to allow us to connect that theory to a subject matter, like archival science. So an interpretation of the theory is a relationship between statements of a theory and what we call contensive statements. I mean, the statements that corresponds to them in the real world of the subject matter, like archival science. So we say that in this case, we have an interpretation of the theory in the subject matter. Okay, subject matter is given from experience. We know things about archival science, about records. We know things. We do, and the community agrees on some things. But now the question is, does my theory, is it actually an interpretation? Do we have an interpretation? That means, do we have a match between those two? In our case, we're going to be interested in a theory that is consistent, decidable, and deductive, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the interpretation is said to be full as opposed to partial if there is a contensive statement for each statement in the theory. That means that each statement you can build in the theory has an equivalent in the subject matter. All of them can be mapped to something. And in our case, it's going to be the case. The correspondent contensive statements are called interpretants. So the interpretants are those statements in the subject matter that corresponds to a certain statement in the theory. So, for example, an interpretant of a physical theory, a theory in physics, may have, an interpretation of a physical theory may have an interpretant which can be experimentally tested, right? So usually you're going to try to build a theory in physics in such a way that statements that correspond to that theory can be tested so you can verify the theory is correct, right? An interpretation is valid when the interpretant of every theorem is true. And in everything I have here on the left in the theory being a subset of statements that are all true, right? It's a set of theorems. It's built in such a way that all the corresponding interpretation in the subject matter, the interpretants, are all true, okay? And then we say that an interpretation is adequate if, yeah, there you go, that's better like that. An interpretation is adequate when every statement whose interpretant is true is also a theorem. So it's the other way around. That means that what is true in archival science, you're going to find also in the theory that goes with it. And we talk about an acceptable theory when the interpretation we are using is both valid and adequate, and also the theory fits the purpose it's built for. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Now I want to try to apply that to the problem of recording context and archival science. So if we try to use the examples from the recording context ontology, so a recording context is indeed a formal theory. We use RDF as a standard. but it could be something else. But RDF are formal files. The subject matter is archival description, and we have statements and theorems. So here are 3 examples, and I'm using that kind of formal way of describing, but there is really no ground behind that. One is to say that an activity documents a record resource documents an activity, and an instantiation documents an activity. Well, only I'm missing my. There you go. Well, this is not. I made it in PowerPoint, and I think when it's using the Google slides, it's slightly modified a little bit. But the theorems here are the 2 latest statements. So the first one is incorrect. An activity doesn't document record resource. Does it mean that it's not a statement? No, it is still a statement. In my language, I can have that, but it's a statement that is outside of my theory. It's somewhere here, right? So it's not a theorem. However, the 2 others are theorems. A record resource documents an activity, and an instantiation documents an activity. Or at least in some world, I can assume that these are theorems. That means they are true. Now, RICO is both consistent, decidable, and deductive. That's very important for us. We want a consistent theory. That means that you cannot deduce anything from the theory. That means the theory somehow isolates a subset of true statements. If it is inconsistent, it's going to collapse with that larger circle, basically. Because when you have an inconsistent system, you can deduce anything. So if you have P and not P true in a system, you have an inconsistent system. And logically, when you have P and not P true in the same time, anything becomes true. Okay? Anything can become true from those 2 statements. So we want a consistent system. The good thing about using RDF and OWL is that OWL allows you with what is called the reasoner. So when you can use it in the Protégé application or with other means, but there is a reasoner attached to it that allows you to check at all time if your system is consistent. So it is possible, it's rich enough that you can build an inconsistent system, right? You can create some rules and some relations that are such that it's inconsistent, but it will tell you. It will tell you. So you can at all times decide if make sure it's consistent. You cannot create something that is undecidable. That's very important. It's always decidable. OWL always gives you an answer. And that's really what is powerful with those tools, is that you cannot end up in a situation where your system is so complex that you can never have an answer. If you take any programming language, because it's Turing complete, you will always have the possibility of never having an answer, right? So if you say, oh, I'm going to program my ontology in Java, great. You're going to have much more freedom than in that OWL. But there is no guarantee that your program will ever return a result. You might end up in an infinite loop. And it's actually very likely you will at some point. OWL is a safeguard. It's a guardrail. It says there's something you can do, but there's something you can't do. And it gives you a framework such that everything you express always in a decidable space. Sorry, ontology web language. Yeah. It was developed at the time of web semantics, where people were trying to develop a web that is kind of like a big graph. So it was very popular in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's kind of went down in popularity from this perspective of web semantics, but it's still incredibly popular among ontologists because it's really the most powerful tool we have to describe ontologies. I would say along with maybe TypeDB and a few others like that. But it's kind of a major standard for describing rich ontologies. Thank you for the question. Please ask questions.
I've been interrupted already. I will continue the interruption. You said it is not true that an activity documents a record resources. Well, unless the activities are archival description, because that's what it does.
Well, we're going to get to that. Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. I'm always, I'm always intentionally putting out there bold statements to create reaction and be corrected so that it creates interaction. That's great. Please keep interrupting. RICO is also deductive. That's also the whole point. We have the reasoner that is able to make inferences. So when you say documents is the inverse of is documented by, you don't need to give the information of what is documented by what. Automatically, if you say X documents Y, and you ask with a Sparkle query, what is Y documented by, it's going to answer you X, even if you didn't put it in the system. It's going to deduce it. I'm giving here a very simple example, but there are richer examples. And I think, I mean, in my opinion, insofar as those reasoning capabilities can be pretty powerful and advanced, we can talk about AI system here, right? I think we can improve them, and that's part of our studies role, but that's not the topic right here. Interpretation is full. There's nothing you can say in RDF within our world of recurring context that doesn't have a meaning in the real world. So it's full in that sense. Now let's talk about validity and adequacy, because I think that's where things start to be interesting. Validity, all theorems have a true contensive statement, a true interpretant. Yes, I mean, insofar, if you look at what can come out of recording context, and that's usually how it works, you develop a theory where you look at it and everything that you can build from there has a true statement on the side of the subject matter. Adequacy is all consensive true statements of archival size correspond to a statement that is a theorem. That is not the case. So one of them is actually more difficult to achieve and verify. Any idea which one is more complex? Which one is more problematic between validity and adequacy? Do you have an idea? This one is fundamentally harder to achieve. Adequacy, yes, because adequacy, you start from something that is intuitive. We have a general understanding of archival science. I mean, you guys do, I don't, but of how things come together, and we want to try to match that to a formal theory. The other is much easier to say, I have my formal theory, and given the way it's built, everything in there is true in the real world. So yes, we have validity. Do we have adequacy? And kind of the mistake, the common mistake is to think because I have validity, my system is good. But that's not true. You can have a very, very small set of things that come out of your system that are true indeed, but it's missing a lot of things. And that's why I would like to talk about adequacy a little bit. So RICO, valid but not adequate. A record can document an activity. That's what RIC says, and that's true. So RIC says that, and that's true in the real world. But then the real world can answer back, yeah, but I want an activity to have a record as its object. So I'm just talking about, that's exactly what Luciana was talking about. What about an activity that is about a record? Like I'm going to create a record or use a record or search or access. Well, if I look here, I put an excerpt of everything that has a relationship with activity. There is nothing like that. An activity is linked to a record only insofar as a record creates an activity in the whole theory. So here we have a problem. We have a true statement on the side of the subject matter that says, well, an activity should be able to have a record as its object. So in the case of use, create, etc. But it's not the case. So that is a problem of adequacy. I'm taking another example. The physical location has coordinates. That comes from the theory. To look at the theory, you can deduce that physical location has coordinates. Fine, that's true. But isn't a physical location a place? I don't know, maybe it's not, but intuitively I would think it is. Well, if I look back at the theory, physical location is not a place. It's not true. It's not a true statement of the theory. So we have two examples here of things that intuitively make sense and are true, but don't find their equivalent on the side of theory. And I think there are many other examples like that. So we have a whole, like, the red is like a hole a hole in the subject matter. There's a whole range of true statements that don't find their equivalent in the theory. Yes, please.
By saying physical, you say it is a place.
Mm-hmm.
If you just say location is location of place, then you can say may not be. But physical location is etymological place.
It is not a place?
It is a place.
Yeah,
Physical
yeah,
is a place.
that's what I think. I mean, intuitively, I would say a physical location, Regis campus is a physical location. Well, if it's a physical location, it's also a place. Yeah, no, that's typically an example. But you see how it's interesting that if you say, so those things are subclasses of thing. You say, hey, in our ontology, we need physical location. Yes, everybody's going to say yes, that's true. We need that. We need place. Yes, everybody agrees. We need place. Well, okay, so that's true. Physical location should be a thing. Place should be a thing. Both of those are true. Both of those are true, and that contributes to make the theory valid. But now you look from the side of what are all the true things about those things? Well, a physical location should be a place. But if you look back at the theory doesn't say that. It's not a theorem of the theory. It's a theorem that an instantiation, no, here, that's a mistake. Don't look at instantiation because that's something I changed. But yeah. Well, and maybe one thing that is missing here is a distinction between location and physical location, for instance. So I'd like to talk about this idea of adequacy. In general, it is difficult to achieve, okay? An acceptable theory is built through a back and forth between the subject matter and the formal system. So you have kind of circle going on here when you build a theory. And it's usually done by working on a partial set of true statements within the subject matter. So you're going to take a partial set of true statements, you're going to build a theory, you're going to go back to the true statements to see, do I have completeness? No, I need to improve it, and so forth. It's actually this process itself is related to a fundamental problem, is how does a formal system relate to intuition? And we can wonder, well, if it's easy to get validity but really hard to get adequacy in general, can you actually achieve adequacy? And the answer is yes, absolutely. There is no essential limit to, there is no essential problem in achieving it. It is just more difficult and more work. But if we assume a general agreement in the community, even on a subject that is not entirely formal, like archival science, if we assume, and I think, if we put everybody here in the room and say, hey, let's agree on a system. Might not be the best, but we agree on the description of archival records, we could reach, without any problem, adequacy of the system by just tweaking things in a way that works. And I'd like just to touch on the example of the church steering thesis, which is a really interesting example of adequacy in a very, very broad topic, which is computation. The idea is to say, hey, can we create a model of computation to describe what computing is and what it can do and not do? And several people worked on that same problem in the 30s and reached the same conclusion independently from different systems. And they said, whether we take that system or that system or that system, they all describe and define the idea of algorithm and computation, in a sense. There are different systems. They are all equivalent. We can prove that they're equivalent. But the difficulty still resides in the fact that you cannot prove that this is adequate. You can see it. You can show it, you can give evidence, but you cannot prove it. Why? Because essentially, the notion, intuitive notion of a computation, of what it is to take a piece of paper and do some computation by hand, this intuitive notion that we have since, I don't know, the Greeks and before, it's still an intuitive notion. You cannot rigorously say, well, that intuitive notion equals that formal system I built. But you can have enough evidence and enough people to say, yes, it does. I cannot prove it, but it does. So in this area that is very broad and complex, we reached adequacy through what we call the church-turing thesis. That means this thesis that says, it's not a proof, it's not a theorem, but we say, hey, this is the definition of computation. And the same way I say, well, there's no reason we could not say, hey, that's the definition of archival records. So what's the problem with Greek ontology? The problem I would like to propose is that the domain is too large. Okay, that's as simple as that. It's not necessarily, there might be a problem on agreements in the community, but I think that's only a first step in the problem. The larger problem, because the agreements, the people who in ICA who came up with that, they agree with each other. So that's not in itself a problem. The problem is that the domain is too large, because archival and sense domain, if you think about it, is everything. And I think that's one of the difficulty, is that, well, there is a subdomain having to do with specific archival management, right? But in the end, you don't want an ontology that doesn't talk about what the records are about. It's records in context. You need the context of the records. And the context of the record is the whole world in the whole history of humanity, potentially. So, what? It's life, yes, 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 yeah. I mean, in some sense, maybe, yes, maybe everything is a bit large because, well, you know, I was going to say maybe some faraway galaxy is not concerned with the record, but you never know. I mean, if a record has to do with NASA, you know, capturing some waves or something like that from the cosmic universe, that does it. So the thing is that eventually, when you say record in context, the context can be everything, and so that is very, very large, and too large to be tackled as one domain. That's kind of the proposition I would like to push forward. If we try to do so, we risk ending up with a laundry list like this. I think that's a laundry list. So that's the current latest version of record in context: instantiation, agent, concept, coordinates, date, event, extent, physical location, place, record, resource, relation, role. These are all the first degree things, I mean concepts under thing. It does look like a laundry list. And I think that's because it's just so hard to tackle everything at once. And by doing that, if we end up with a laundry list, basically just sitting on the table and say, okay, what are the things? Well, here we came up with those 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 things. But they look so arbitrary. And the reason they look so arbitrary is because, again, if we sit and wonder what are the things we talk about in recording context, we attack a domain that is way too large, and that's confusing. So an idea is to divide and conquer, and then we end up missing adequacy, like I said. So divide and conquer, we can divide in two different fundamental ways. Two theories can be completely distinct and independent from each other, or one can be what Curry calls an axiomatic extension of the first one. Okay, so we're going to say that the theory C extends A, or the theory B extends A. So the domain themselves should be treated in a rigorous order. You cannot just stop anywhere. Even if you divide, you have to be very consistent in your way of approaching that problem, and starting with the most general, the core. So in this case, we would start with theory A, and because theory A would contain all the first primitive notions. Okay, so I already talked about that during the workshop, but very quickly, for those who were not there, primitive notions are the axioms of the ontology. They are the building blocks that are necessary to derive other notions. So I've presented here different ways of getting to those primitive notions. You can find them by thinking, okay, what are my either relationships? So that's the most obvious one. If you have X is a Y, then Y is going to be more primitive than X. But has a kind of like attribute style relationship also gives you an idea of what is primitive. An event has a date. Event is going to be more fundamental and primitive than dates. Okay. And physical location has a coordinate. Physical location is going to be more primitive. By doing that, we can slowly abstract from our laundry list a smaller subset of concepts that are the basis, and we can focus on them and just write a high-level ontology with just them. And then we can extend it. And RDF OWL will have no problem doing that. You can have a RIC high-level, RIC 1, RIC 2, RIC 3. And you put them all together, and then you can query. But the RIC 1 is going to be independent. It's going to be very high level. It's going to be all about the founder. And then you tackle only that. And you create something entirely consistent in that, where you don't need to bother about coordinates. You should not have coordinates in a high-level ontology. You should not. There's no reason. You can talk about tons of things without wondering about coordinates. So another way to detect primitive relation is to replace, to say the sentence, I can conceive X without Y, but not the other way around. If you can do that, then X is more primitive than Y. I gave a few examples here, but the point here is to really kind of distill a first range of primitive notions that are going to constitute my high-level ontology and focus on that first. Completely make abstraction from the rest. And that way, we could build a general schema with only the most. So here is an example of what I think could a general schema look like. You could have just five elements: agent, date. Well, I wanted to remove date. Agent, event, place, record, resource. Maybe that's the only four they are at the top level. And you can create a whole ontology with relationship, everything with just those four. It's going to be already very rich. And there's pretty more than those four. Yes, Tracy.
How would you bring in other ontologies?
You just.
Some systems have their own ontologies, so they would be records in and of themselves, no?
Yeah.
How would that fit into your?
You just they have to fit. So they're going to be extension of that one. So you're going to then create another ontology where you subdivide place into the kind of place you can have in that sub-ontology. But it's going to not be a problem at all. If you use the same terminology, it's going to be just a series of RDF files. So you're going to have an RDF file with that one and another one. You see what I mean? No?
I do. What I'm saying is digital twins, spatial ontologies, et cetera, they all have their own thing in their own systems and subsystems in their own databases.
Yes.
So how would all of their stuff
Fit.
come into the archive and be captured?
It's already the intention of recording context to be a high-level ontology that is going to which you're going to plug your more specific ontology, where because you're in NASA, you need the category called, satellites, whatever. All of those things are going to be, but precisely, I think that's also missing in recording context, because I took the example the other day of activity type, where they anticipate you creating some instances of activity instead of saying, well, we're going to have subclasses that we're going to create of activity. We're going to prepare something where people can just add their individuals. And I think maybe one of the mistakes of recording context is to think, well, people are just going to add individuals to it. They're going to use it directly with just individuals, not with concepts and classes. But I think fundamentally, the idea here of that kind of arc is to say, from the very beginning, you think of ontology as building blocks of abstract classes that can be plugged to each other. So that even the person who arrived with their own archival department, their own problem, their own ontologies, they can plug their ontologies. The same way we've plugged our ontologies when we built RICO and said, hey, we have our super high level, then we have a common sense schema, and then we have archival science schema that come together. Well, you're going to have your archival domain, specific domain schema, coming together as well. But in every time, these are concepts that come, so they are always extension of the theory. They have to be consistent and compatible, but there is no reason, if you build your high-level one well, any ontology of anybody should be compatible. It should always work, yes.
I want to go in the opposite direction. I have a very strong prejudice from decades of building systems.
Yes.
And in building whatever system it was, I and people I'm working with would start from a premise. Any model is not a model of reality, is a perspective on reality. And Rick, is very much something that has its own context. And it can't tell you what a record is because it's only looking at what I need to describe about a record. It's not telling me what I need to know to appraise a record, what I need to know to preserve a record, to intellectually manage a record that's under my control. And it doesn't even acknowledge that there are different contexts of description. In the US, the common assumption among archivists is that description is effectively synonymous with finding aids. But there's another context in which description is a basis for asserting authenticity. So authenticity is a binary value, but an assertion of authenticity is a belief statement. So a description that addresses concerns of authenticity, which RICO doesn't really at all, is going to give you a basis for saying, I believe this is or is not authentic. And that would be a very different ontology.
Is there a context where you don't need agent?
No.
No. No, right? There is none. And I'm saying let's push that question as far as we can to build those higher level such that any ontology from any archivist in the world can match that.
Okay.
And then you can have modules that are more specific. So you could imagine at some level going a little bit more specific and say, this is going to be public records kind of ontology specific. This is going to be space exploration, whatever. But I think there's so much work that can be done on the top level where we can just deal with the things that you will always, always, always need. And you put them in such a general way that everybody will want to use it that way. Yes?
But that top level should be archival science, not description. Description is subsidiary to archival.
Yes, that's a good, yeah, you had.
I kind of want to have you unpack the dependency piece of this in the context of like dispositive and probative records. So a probative record would be something created to document an act that has occurred. But a dispositive record would be one that in its completion actually constitutes the act happening, like a marriage certificate.
Oh, yeah.
Or no, that would be probative. No.
Like
a
contract.
A contract.
A contract.
So the act doesn't exist until both parties sign and it's done. And the record is made. So in terms of dependencies, would it be that obviously in the probative case, you'd have the act would happen and that would then generate the record, but in a dispositive case, could that be reversed? Or is the schema flexible enough that can be?
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I think to describe that kind of complex interaction between the act, the activity, and the record, you can build a high-level schema that is going to be rich enough that you can see those those connections between action and record. I mean, there is a whole theory of illocutionary acts that talks about that. You know, like a judge says, "I condemn you." This is a performative act. I mean, because it's performative language. Like by saying the thing happens, like marriage, and so yeah. But that's typically a good example of if you have the right theory at a high level, but you're going to have to abstract. To do that at a high level, you're going to have to abstract completely from the case of records and action and marriage and notary. You have to think very abstractly and say, okay, an act can create a record and a record can create an act. And those relationships exist, and they exist even outside of the world of archival description. And you have to think somehow outside of that world to build that high level. And then the thing downstream are going to match those structures that you created, if that makes sense. Sorry. Yes, I think I'm
We're
at the
running
end.
out of time.
Yes.
You can,
Okay.
No.
I know.
Finish up. You've got a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's so this kind of describes the kind of dependency you could have between different blocks. And again, all those blocks are all kind of like sub-theories on which you work on. So they are like little recurring context ontologies. They are all their own ontologies. And then only downstream, you're going to actually have your individuals. But here, I'm not even talking about individuals. I'm not even talking about populating the ontologies. I'm just talking about concepts and relationships, okay? My last slide is just like I did during the workshop. I think it's important because we talk a lot about AI and machine learning to say that we're on a completely different world here because we're talking about a theory as having this very strong truth connection with the real world, right? Through this idea of interpretation I talked about. We're not having an empirical perspective here like machine learning does, okay? It's not probabilistic, it's not statistics, it's not because a whole bunch of things happen, we can guess that this is going to happen again, okay? We're really at a formal level, and data can help us see some patterns emerge. So I would say you could use machine learning to try to get some intuition of the theory. But in some sense, at the end of the day, it is a purely human activity. There's no way around thinking what is, particularly in a context where the definitions of records in their context is entirely in our minds here of a community. There's no way around getting around the table and thinking, what is it fundamentally? What are the definitions? And how do we formalize them? That is a completely other world different than machine learning. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention and your question. Love the interaction.
Thank you. Thanks, Hugo. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and I'm going to reorganize the way we're recording this a little bit. So for the people who are listening on the live stream, I apologize. I'm going to close the live stream, but we will be posting the recordings when everything is done. So 10-minute break, 15-minute break, and we'll come back. Thank you.